Welcome to This Jungian Life. Three good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod.
So today we wanted to take up this topic of projection, which is a common psychological term both in Jungian thought and also in psychoanalytic thought generally. This topic was requested of me by one of our listeners, and I thought it was a really good and important one. And it's a key idea that was very important to Jung and how he saw the psyche functioning. So we're going to talk a little bit about what projection is, what Jung thought about it, what role it plays. And then we're going to talk a little bit about what it's like to be on the receiving end of projections, both positive and negative.
You know, I'm almost surprised that we haven't discussed this before, because it is one of those things that is absolutely universal, integral, daily, just so much part of the warp and weft of human nature that it's interesting we haven't touched on it before. So maybe what we ought to start out with is exactly what it means, which is right there in the name. And I always have this image of like a film camera that projects the film out there onto a screen through another person or a situation where we project our internal contents, biases, complexes, longings, all kinds of things onto the screen that usually another person provides for us, as if we're just screening our own movie.
Right. Jung has this great quote where he says, "Projections change the world into the replica of one's unknown face." And there's so much in that quote. But we don't project qualities we're consciously aware of, that we have a conscious relationship with, right? We project things that we're not fully aware of in ourselves onto other people.
I mean, why even say that the psyche itself, in an effort to make itself known, generates projections as part of the individuation process?
Right. Jung was very clear that projection is normal. We all do it. And it does have this positive function of introducing us to unknown parts of ourselves.
And it also serves a defensive function, that when we can't or don't want to recognize some part of our own shadow, it's very typical, and we've all done it, to project it onto somebody else, you know? The person that works across the hall from me is, always late and snippy and unsocial and critical. And I would deny till the last ditch that those are qualities that I myself possess.
Right. And when we talked about shadow, we pointed out that one of the best ways to get to know your shadow is who is the person who bothers you a lot and what is the thing about that person that bothers you the most. And that's your shadow stuff that you're projecting onto that person. And we talked about this at the time too, that the person you project that stuff on, there's always a hook, right? You don't just project it on anyone. It sticks because there's something true about it. But the extra heat that we feel indicates that it's something arising within us that we can't allow ourselves to know about ourselves. So we project it on someone else. And that's how it's operating as a defense, because it keeps us from having to be in contact with this part of ourselves that feels inadmissible.
I remember when Lisa, you and I got to visit the psychology club in Zurich this summer. And that was a club that Jung founded of people who were interested in what he was studying and interested in psychology in general. And we were told that he founded the psychology club in order to help people learn about their own shadows, and that as they rubbed up against one another and were irritated by one another or disagreed or any of that stuff, that would be the raw material, the prima materia for, oh, I'm projecting.
And that has been the model of Jungian institutes worldwide ever since, hasn't it?
Well, it really goes back to how very normal it is that our psyches really collide and rub up against one another, and we abrade each other. And lots of psychic material is generated in our normal relational interactions, especially when we really care deeply about something. And then it's heated. And the question is, how do we use that as material to spur our own developmental and integrative functions, rather than just leaving it with the other person who is pronounced in some way negative?
I'm thinking about how projection is an important part of the analytic process.
Mm-hmm.
Because, if things are really cooking in the analytic container, then there's a certain amount of projection that's going on. Usually the analysan projects something onto the analyst. I don't know that that's true all of the time, but it certainly can be an element of it, and it can be an important element of it. That sometimes the analyst needs to hold the projection of, for example, the self or the good mother or other elements that the analysan might need to come into contact with.
I would say that that's probably one of the most challenging and draining parts of being an analyst in the room. That as the client begins to use the analytic relationship in different ways, that it can be very taxing, either to, like you said, realize something very positive is being projected, and then the analyst has to make sure not to violate that. And if something negative is being projected, the ferocity and hostility in the client can be really extraordinary.
Yeah, and you have to hold it either way, right? And then you eventually, I think, have to start frustrating it and kind of giving little doses of reality so that the client can take the projection back. And it's a very delicate process.
I'm aware that in the consulting room, we are all, at least I hope all, very aware of these transferential dynamics of stuff that gets transferred from client to therapist and vice versa. But there are many other people that really attract projections: teachers, clergy, doctors,
celebrities.
Yeah, who are not always necessarily schooled in even being aware that a projective dynamic or a transferential dynamic is taking place.
And so in that way, the only requirement for being a screen for projection is that you are frequently visible to a certain number of people, that it's just the availability of the individual allows them to be used in that way. But also the fact that very little is known about them personally, so that there's not a conflict with the fantasy material.
But I do think that there are some people who, either because of the role they inhabit, like a clergy or a doctor, or because maybe a stance that they've taken, or something that they've produced, a work of art or something, kind of capture a certain amount of fantasy material and draw kinds of projections. So I don't know that it's just availability. I think there's, we can sort of, if we're looking for a savior and someone takes a stand, then we're all projecting hero onto a certain person. And it can be absolutely crushing. The weight of it, especially I think as you're saying, Joseph, if you're not prepared for it, if you don't understand that there's this projective dynamic going on, it alters your psyche to carry projections. It absolutely does, I think. And it can, I think that this is a lot of what happens when you see celebrities kind of flame out, is that they've just not been able to bear up under the weight of these tremendous, tremendous projections.
So I'm building on what you've said, Lisa, about the hero as a magnet for projections. We want to find the hero in ourselves. And so maybe it's some cowboy film star hero. But there's also the healer, the wisdom figure, the wise man or the wise woman, and certainly the mother. I think there's people that are nurturing or perceived to be nurturing, that we project onto others some of the qualities that we most desperately long for in ourselves.
So, Deb, I was reflecting on your comment that we sometimes project things that we need out onto the world, and I'm wondering if you could say more about that.
Well, I'm just thinking that we project a hero or a healer, a wisdom figure, because we want to be those things for ourselves and in ourselves. That those are qualities that we hope for that are, perhaps undeveloped, haven't in some way come online, kind of golden shadow. But of course, we also project, all kinds of negative things, the villain, the bitch, all kinds of things as well. So it goes both ways of what we seem to locate in other people.
And it can be a kind of mystery in terms of how the psyche, or perhaps how the self within the psyche, prioritizes which of the inner figures is heating up inside of us and therefore is more likely to be projected, because it's like a heat-seeking missile in a way. But there's a pressure in us to come into knowledge about something.
And this makes me think of a time when projection certainly happens, is when we're falling in love. Because that falling in love experience certainly has an element of projection in it, that we're projecting something very tender and important to ourselves onto the beloved. And this is why sometimes when someone is struggling with an impossible love, they're just so drawn to someone who's unavailable for some reason, and it's not going to be able to be lived out in the real world. An important question to ask is, what is the thing that you love most about that person? What is the thing that captures you? What's the thing you feel jealous of about that person? And it often is something that we need to develop in ourselves.
And often that's one of the most important reparative questions to hold after a love affair fails, is because all of the positive attributes that we project onto the other person, which we mourn the loss of when the relationship ends, are exactly the things we need to put onto our New Year's resolution list in terms of developing. And it really does mediate the sense of loss.
Yeah, I definitely does.
And I think I just want to add here that one of the very, very hardest things to do, especially in the case of a love relationship that has ended, is to take back the projection. It runs so deep in us to put that projection onto another person that it's really not me. I really don't connect with those qualities in myself, and they must belong to him.
And I think that when we're in that state and we're mourning the beloved, it feels like that person took a part of our soul with them, and that we can't get it back. And I've also seen this, by the way. Sometimes people will come into treatment with me and they had a profound transference with the previous therapist that didn't get resolved. And they feel that same kind of feeling, like that part of their soul is held with the other person. And then our work is, for me, if I can, to help them withdraw that, so they can feel whole again. It's a very, very painful place.
And there's such a lot of just basic human reality in it, because we are truly relational creatures. And so to find those pieces of ourselves rather than finding them in others is very difficult work.
And I think more so when it's a negative projection, of course. But I find also that when we're analyzing a negative projection, if we can look deeply enough, most negative qualities have a positive application, which we would be more willing to own. So, for instance, maybe there's a neighborhood bully that really gets your steam up and you really want to go after them, and you're absolutely convinced that they're the only person in the neighborhood who's carrying this quality. But upon self-reflection, we might see that, the bully is also carrying easy access to aggression, and that the individual who's projecting it may, in fact, very much need a kind of appropriate and temperate access to aggression or self-assertion, which, if it were reclaimed, might allow the person to take some really important steps in the world.
Yeah, I mean, I always think that dreams are really interesting because they tend to exaggerate things. Dreams tend to overstate things. And I think that that's probably true of how the psyche works in general. So that, Joseph, just like you're saying, what we wind up projecting looks super exaggerated. But really, we are trying to, our psyche is tending toward wholeness and trying to get us closer to something that we need, but we might need it in a small amount, or it might not be quite so dramatic.
So in a way, some of these very intense feelings of, using your example, Joseph, of the neighborhood bully that really gets my dander up. I mean, I really like to just clock him one. It's exaggerated because something is trying to get our attention. And that under all this massive bigness and exaggerated emotion is something very real, and that nugget of what would be my own appropriate access to my aggression.
And of course, being able to have that inquiry would begin to free up some energy just to be able to shift from constantly focusing outwardly to the person in the neighborhood, just to taking a part of the energy, focusing into one's psyche. But I also want to bring up something that Marie-Louise von Franz wrote extensively about in her book, Projection and Recollection, is that when we project onto another person, let's say my own bullying or aggressive capacities are being projected onto the neighborhood person, it really is as if a dart of hostility has left me, and in this very odd spiritual way has landed in the other person and has made them even more sick than perhaps they would have been before, has actually encouraged them to act in an even more aggressive way by projecting onto this. And von Franz compared this to a number of kind of ancient primal religions where curses and other kinds of malefic ideas would be placed onto other people or tribes, and perhaps she felt really negatively influence other people. She took this very, very seriously.
Yeah, well, and the psychoanalytic version of that is projective identification, right? That we tend to identify unconsciously with the expectations that other people have of us. So what gets projected on us tends to influence and shape our behavior, even unconsciously. But I love what you're bringing up about von Franz, and I'm shocked. I haven't read that book, and I don't know that I knew it existed. So I know what I'm doing as soon as we're off the air here. But I think it's really true. I once myself was in a situation in a group of people who decided that I was who decided that I had some very negative qualities, that I was incompetent, that I was any number of other things. And it just became sort of a fixed belief in this group that I was a part of. And I could feel it. I could feel this disapprobation coming my way all the time. And it made it very hard for me to behave naturally. And I found myself often making little mistakes, or sort of, stepping in, piles of metaphorical dog poo. And it really constrained me. And the way it felt at the time, I remember thinking it was as if someone had cast a spell. And I think that projections can work, negative and positive, can, again, really influence the psyche. It takes a sturdy psyche to be able to bear projections.
And Jung said that the best antidote to that is if we have enough self-knowledge about, for instance, let's say a negative projection, so that we understand that we do have that capacity, let's say, to bully, so we're already titrating it or restraining it, and then we're much less vulnerable to being provoked into overexpressing it. But I did want to bring up two things, because I feel like the Jungian view and the Freudian view are quite different. So from the Freudian perspective, the idea would be the neighbor would imagine inserting their aggression into you, and then they would exercise very specific behaviors to try to provoke you relationally into bringing that forward. Because Jung had a much more kind of mystical view of things and believed in the collective unconscious, and also had an energic or energy-based view of the world. He really felt that a kind of force could leave us when we project, and in a way that's almost inexplicable, land in the other person, pull behaviors forward, separate from any kind of interactional dynamics.
Yeah, and I think I'm really signing up, not surprisingly, for Jung's view here. You know, there's the way that negative projections can kind of make us ill, Joseph, as you're saying. And then there's the weight of positive projections. And I'm thinking of again, the inflation that comes with that. If we're an analyst and we're carrying big projections, if our clients project the self on us or fall in love with us, I'm thinking about clergy and how they often carry enormous projections, and that can bring inflation that isn't always well handled. I don't always think that therapists or analysts hold it well either, because you've got to be willing to disidentify from the thing that's projected on you.
So you're bringing up how important it is to be able to bring some of this into consciousness in order to differentiate what is me from what is person A, B, C, or D, and how powerful it is. Of what Jung said is we infect each other.
Yes. Yeah,
and
that's great.
The unconscious to unconscious communication and power also even reminds me of magic. You know, of casting, we've mentioned casting a spell on someone. And that this stuff is very powerful and it's very real. And our only salvation is in being able to separate or differentiate myself from my hostile workmates, let's say.
You know, another thing that we're talking about here with this kind of almost magical look at projection is the reality that we're dealing with archetypes. And it's an activated archetype that's in the room when something big gets projected on someone else. You know, shadow, or the self, or the beloved, the anima. And that is some heady stuff. I mean, there is a real kind of psychic charge that goes with this.
I think that's really, really important, that this gets bigger than just a personal thing between Judy and Jane. That's why it's so powerful.
So I have this little example here that I'm just kind of making this up. I don't really know that this is what happened. But back in 2012, there was a film director named Jason Russell who had made a short documentary called Coney 2012 about this African warlord. And it went viral. It had over 83 million views on YouTube. He kind of became an activist trying to bring this warlord Coney to the International Criminal Court. And there was just a lot of attention all at once. All of this attention focused on him, all of these people kind of joining in this. And then in March of 2012, at the height of this video's popularity, the San Diego police arrested him, or I guess detained him for psychiatric evaluation. He was vandalizing cars and making sexual gestures after removing his underwear during a public breakdown. It was filmed and released online. And he was hospitalized for several weeks. And he said that the diagnosis was a brief reactive psychosis that was brought on by exhaustion, stress, and dehydration. But I hear in that he found himself the recipient of all of these projections of kind of hero projections, right? He was going to go get the bad guy. And he was carrying all these projections. He was totally unprepared for it. And it actually made him ill.
I can relate to that in a very small way about how it can throw us off. There was a time in my life when I was doing an awful lot of lecturing and I was leading a lot of small groups. And as always happens, there's initially a lot of positive projections. And I had this very strange reaction to it all the time, is that when somebody would make in the group one or two overly idealizing reactions, I would have this overwhelming impulse to add curse words to the lecture. Like this intense impulse to be a little more coarse than usual as a reaction to that.
Mm-hmm. That it's so uncomfortable to be idealized like that because it's such a straitjacket.
That is so understandable, as, the tendency to compensate for being idealized by going exactly in the other way. And then the need to be able to hold the tension of that and not actually manifest it behaviorally, but to, again, bring, and I'm sure you did, bring it into awareness of, okay, this projection does not really resonate with me, so I'm going to try to balance it out by imagining sallying forth with a string of curse words.
Well, I think you're attributing a lot more consciousness to it than I was experiencing at the time.
You mean I'm projecting consciousness onto you?
I know. I was cursing like a sailor all of a sudden in the middle of a lecture. But it speaks to the power and the unpredictability of how one's psyche will respond to a projection, whether it's a positive or a negative projection.
Yeah. And I mean, I think when we get idealizing positive projections, like, boy, that feels pretty amazing. And it really does. It feels great. And there's this way that's really dangerous too, because you can just want to bask in that and, continue calling that forth and look for it. And you can get really reliant on it. I mean, I'm thinking of this moment where Judy Garland, toward the end of her life, she was performing, I think it was in Paris, and apparently she was quite intoxicated, and she's just begging the audience for applause. And it's just clear she can't live without that kind of positive projection on her, that it's kind of what keeps her propped up, and that there isn't a sense of self. She just needs that adulation.
So she has projected her self-esteem onto the audience and their applause.
Right. And needs to receive their projections to feel okay.
Mm-hmm.
So we're also moving around this realm of being relieved of a projection, because there is a downside to projection, that when we are projecting, that we are isolated from our environment to some degree, because instead of having a real relationship to someone or a situation, we're having an illusory one. It's a fantasy one. And so in that regard, we have kind of lost something. So Jung kind of distributed through his works a couple of steps that he would imagine people would have to go through in order to move out of a projection. And of course, the first would be to recognize that the person is in a projection, that they're convinced that what they're seeing in this particular case is the absolute truth. Then there's this gradual recognition that there really is a difference between who the person really is and the positive or negative fantasy. And this dawning of awareness could pop up in a dream, or it might pop up in some other very spontaneous way. But that's just the kind of beginning of the work. Then he surmised that there had to be a really curious mental process where the individual had to really assess and think about the discrepancies. They had to kind of work to validate the differences between the actual person and the fantasy, and finally reach a conclusion that they just had been wrong, that what they believed about the other person was really simply not true. Now, that's often where a lot of traditional psychoanalytic inquiry might stop. But Jung wanted people to go into a much more profound spiritual process, which is to search for the origin of the projection in one's personal unconscious material, as well as, and someone had brought up earlier, in the collective archetypal world, to try to trace it back to an even deeper level. And that could, in fact, restore a kind of unity to the individual who was projecting. And by coming into a much greater self-knowledge about the projected material, would make it unlikely for it to have to be projected again in order for it to be known.
Wow, that's really quite a process. The process of withdrawing a projection, but also becoming much more individuated, much more conscious, and being able to really integrate all of those aspects that you just talked about, Joseph, of that realization of, wow, that is what is going on in me. You bring it home. You know, that's what I often say to people is, but that's what you can have. You can have your own processes. You can have your own healing, growth in consciousness, and individuation. If it's all out there onto other people or situations, you don't have any control over it. This you can have. It will yield dividends.
You know, I'm thinking about sort of the converse question is, how do we manage being projected onto? And I don't know that I have as elegant a formula as you've laid out, Joseph, but I do have an image, which is, I remember that I am the surfer and not the wave.
Can you say more about that?
Well, I think that, you know, when, let's say, someone's projecting something tremendously positive on us, that it can feel, you know, you just literally feel puffed up, you know, you feel different. It awakens your whole psyche, and it can feel like, well, maybe this is true. Maybe I really am this fabulous. But that's dangerous. That's dangerous because it could lead to inflation, and we can do some very dangerous things when we're inflated. And so I think that my image of being the surfer, not the wave, is I'm riding this wave, but I'm not this wave. This power is not mine. And this wave could easily just throw me down on the sandy bottom floor any minute too. And so I have to respect it, you know, and treat it with reverence, actually, and acknowledge that it will end also, because projections always do.
And I'm thinking about just being curious about it. What are those qualities? Because then that can help the person realize that they reside in her or him, and start to integrate the projection that they have onto you or onto me, onto any of us.
Mm-hmm.
I think Jung famously struggled to understand projection and countertransference, and was working that out. But certainly later in his life, there's a kind of sobering anecdotal story that's told about him. And I think Jung's attitude became to neither resist nor encourage a projection upon oneself. And there's a story which I don't think I'm going to tell correctly, but that one of his patients had fallen in love with him and had begun to send love letters, and Jung would not write back, and then began telling people in the community that they were having an affair, and he didn't respond. And then this woman began telling people in the community that they were going to get married, and Jung didn't respond. And then the woman communicated that the wedding date had been planned, and that the invitations were going out, and Jung didn't respond. And then finally, he got a letter from the woman saying that the wedding was off.
That's great. I don't know that I'd heard that straight, but that's great. He just let it run its course.
He just contained himself and just trusted that the psyche was going to be a self-righting ship on the water.
As it often is. I thought I'd bring in just a couple of film images of projection. We were casting around for a fairy tale or myth, and we really thought that film would do it best. So the sort of early obvious one is the Wizard of Oz. That there's this, so much is projected on to the wizard, and the whole quest is to go see the wizard, and he's going to fix everything. And then really, he's just this bumbling man behind the curtain, right?
Yes.
Who's been, looking for these, who's been drawing these projections. And then he has to just reveal himself as he really is. And I mean, I think there's so many movies that deal with this, but one that jumped into my mind right away is American Beauty, which I haven't seen for a while. But if you remember, Kevin Spacey is this kind of middle-aged dad who goes to some event at his daughter's school, and there's this cheerleader, and it's just a great scene. He's watching her. This idea about what's getting projected onto her is evoked by all these rose petals. He really sees this beautiful sexual anima woman in this young high school student, and that kind of shapes his efforts, his energies throughout the rest of the film, that he wants to be with her. And he's projected all of this stuff onto her. And then there's this moment where that's shattered, and he sees her as just this kind of normal, kind of naive, kind of perhaps even insipid high school student that she actually is.
The film does this wonderful job through these very artistic images of seeing how this girl is idealized and really turned into a mythic figure, as you said, surrounded by rose petals. I think there's one fantasy sequence where she opens her mouth and a rose petal, falls out from her tongue. I mean, she's really been translated into something that is not even human anymore.
It's really archetypal.
Yes.
Totally archetypal and consuming in that way. There's another theme in the movie which is much less beautiful, is that the neighbor, who's an older fellow with a boy that he's raising, his son, and then the father, the neighbor, has this constant fear and hostility that his son is a homosexual and that the son is somehow having an affair with Kevin Spacey. And the man becomes increasingly hostile and goes over finally to confront Kevin Spacey. And in the confrontation, the father actually comes on to Kevin Spacey and is hoping to have an affair with him. And Kevin Spacey lets him know that this is a total misunderstanding, both about the son and about his own sexual orientation. And this explosive violation of the transference, again, of the projection. Of course, the neighbor winds up killing Kevin Spacey.
Joseph, you just gave away the ending.
Oh my God, that movie's been out for so long. How could anybody not know that?
Though, I'm back on those incredible images in the film of the rose petals. How poignant this kind of projection is, because this high school student is an anima image, and that goes so deep in the psyche. It has such power, and a way that the Kevin Spacey character comes into, through his own suffering of this part of himself that he hadn't known before.
Mm-hmm.
He hadn't known before he was seized.
Mm-hmm.
He was seized by this. So in a way, what I think this film says is how projection can become possession.
Yeah, that's great, Deb. And I think that that's actually true. We can become possessed.
Yeah, these projections have this kind of psychic power, and then they have us. We don't have them.
And now I'm thinking of Captain Ahab.
Oh.
And whatever it was he projected on the white whale and became possessed by that.
Yes, and we can project onto inanimate objects. We project onto our pets. We see these videos of animals that are suffering right now across the world, and we project all kinds of components of our own psychological lives, our own inner children, onto these various creatures, that our whole world is influenced by the psychic material which invests images. And even a living person, in a way, is an image that we are relating to. The work, of course, is over a lifetime to call back into ourselves all of these sparks of our own souls that we have actually put out into the world, and reclaiming them so that we and our inner world become the picture of wholeness. And then we're able to interact with outer objects, people, circumstances, with a much more realistic, nuanced, and in a sense, much more soulful way, because we're able to acknowledge how each person and situation is unique and independent in itself.
And I wonder if that would be a good place to switch to a dream.
Hi, this is Joseph from This Jungian Life podcast. Lisa, Deb, and I have been deeply moved by your responses to our work. Producing, editing, and distributing it involves substantial expenses, and now we need your help. Please stop by our website, thisjungianlife.com, and click on the heading Be Our Patron. You'll be redirected to our Patreon funding page. Patreon helps creators connect with people who believe in projects like ours. There, you can sign up with your credit card to support us with as little as $1 a month. And at higher levels of support, we'll provide special episodes, behind-the-scenes photos and stories, and a chance to join a select pool of listeners for dream interpretations. Thank you.
Our dreamer today is a 42-year-old female who works as an artist. And here's her dream. There is a group of young women and girls. I am either one of them or I'm all of them. That's the sense I get. There is the knowledge that one of us has to make a sacrifice for the group. The youngest is chosen. A beautiful girl, maybe 10 or 12 years old, with long dark hair and shiny curls. She is kind and willing to be sacrificed. She is led to an old stone building by two of the other girls, who are twins with bobbed dark hair and harsher personalities. Instructions for the sacrifice are in the building. The next day, the girls and women return to find the sacrifice was completed. The youngest has had to sacrifice herself to make a bowl of soup for the others. The red tomato and herb soup was made with her outer layers of skin and flesh. The sacrifice was made willingly and for the benefit of the group. She gives us a bit of context. I have recently entered therapy wanting to get in touch with my unconscious. My father has passed away recently, and I'm looking for the first time at the difficult relationship we had and my suffocating childhood. I am hoping to find keys to unlock a somatic illness that I have struggled with for years. She adds that her daughter has very long dark hair, and she also had that, although not quite as long as in the dream, and her father had never liked it when she had cut it short.
What I think of immediately is the mythic tale of Iphigenia sacrificing herself for her father, Agamemnon, where they were going to go. Greece was going to go to war with Troy, which was in Turkey. And all the ships were loaded with men and arms, and there was no wind, so the ships could not sail. And it was deemed that a sacrifice had to be made, and it was the king's daughter, Iphigenia, who was to be sacrificed. And even though she was betrothed to Achilles, eventually she acceded and willingly sacrificed herself. And then the wind came and the ships sailed.
So that the daughter is somehow sacrificed for the father.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, this dream, if we're going to kind of start with the archetypal imagery, of course, brought up for me a different kind of sacrifice. This image of them eating the bowl of soup that is made from her flesh brought up the Christian symbolism. This is my body, this is my blood. And that, Christ is sacrificed. And in the Catholic tradition, anyway, the Mass is about the host and the wine are eating of Christ's blood and body.
And in that way, some part of that spiritual force is then transferred into the parishioner who's taking that in, and they are themselves redeemed. So I'm wondering about the kind, young, beautiful girl who is then absorbed into the larger life of the psyche, redeeming or perhaps restoring this kind of kind youthfulness to other parts of the psyche, even though it may seem kind of horrifying in its literalness in the dream.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's significant on this note to point out that the main feelings in the dream were calm and resignation. That feels important to me. The ego is not horrified by this.
That is important, that somehow I guess she feels there's a rightness to the rhythm of the dream.
So maybe the question is, what has been sacrificed? There's a positive and a negative kind of sacrifice. I think the positive, in a very general way, is that something, some new level of consciousness and awareness has been gained by sacrificing something. But then there are also sacrifices that are unnecessary or not worthwhile. Where we talk about it as cutting off your nose to spite your face. So I'm curious as to what might have been sacrificed and what kind of a sacrifice this is.
Yes, and I would be curious about what element of the psyche the young girl might represent. I'm also aware that the word sacrifice comes from the Latin for to make sacred. Mm-hmm. And it is very clear in this dream that this is a sacrifice. We're in some kind of realm here where the spirit is being invoked. It's interesting that the two girls who lead her off have harsher personalities and bobbed hair, and that there's twins. And it makes me wonder, is the sort of too compliant, too kind, overly sweet, sentimental, is that what's being sacrificed in service to a part of the personality that has more access to aggression?
I think that's a sound assumption. And even in the associations at the end of the dream, she says that she had bobbed her hair short and her father had never liked it when she had done that. So that represents, I suspect, the part of her that's not compliant with the suffocating father or has the aggression to stand against.
That's perhaps why that myth came right up, is even though there is no father figure in the dream, he's there in the associations with the twins with the short bobbed hair and her own personal comment that her father didn't like it when she had presumably shorter bobbed hair.
Yeah, I think that the Iphigenia is right there, Deb. I think you're right. That maybe what has to get sacrificed is this part of her that was perhaps overly compliant. 10 to 12 is an interesting age, because usually before about the age of 12, girls are very unself-conscious and fierce, but it's around that age that they begin to tamp down some of that ferocity of spirit and become more aware of what's expected of them, and lose maybe some of that access to their vitality. I mean, that's been written about. So I'm curious about that.
It really ties in here too, doesn't it? What gets sacrificed here is she's kind and willing to sacrifice. Of that kind of compliance seems to be what gets sacrificed, by these two, I mean, it's a doubling image of twins. So it's not just one person who leads her. It's, presumably identical twins of this bobbed hair and harsher personality say, okay, that's it. She's got to go.
And when we return to the Christian symbolism, that in that sacrificed position, Christ is often compared to the Lamb of God, white, innocent, non-aggressive, non-sexual. And so part of the sacrifice of the kind girl, I think, goes to the idea of the pure, the lamb,
mm-hmm.
and therefore a more acceptable sacrifice to the God. So I think we've talked about it in many other dream interpretations, this essential place that most people have to get to sacrifice the puer and the puella. That even though at 42, we could imagine that there still is a clinging to wanting to return to some kind of young way of being in the world, or a kind of youthfulness of attitude, or a resistance to taking on some responsibilities associated with the adult life. And when she talks about the father having passed away recently, I know for myself, when both of my parents finally died, and I realized that I was no longer the child of anyone, that along with that death of my parents, any part of me that fantasized that I was going to be taken care of by any kind of a parental figure died. That the child in me also passed into the underworld with them, and I became really the only adult on the landscape. And I think that's a necessary transition.
I'm wondering, in the context of our topic today of projection, that when a parent dies, we kind of have to take back some of those projections. The projection of, I still have an outer world parent. I'm still someone's child. Perhaps kinds of relational repairs, there's still some hope for that. And when they're gone, something really shifts in the psyche. Just as you said, Joseph, I'm no one's child anymore. There's a kind of awful freedom. It has a harsher edge.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it's both, can be euphoric, just as you said. It can be euphoric and sobering at the same time, but most importantly, it's essential.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that the image is, what is it? It's tomato soup with herbs. Is that right?
Red tomato and herb soup.
Yeah. I mean, that's such an image, and somehow it the image, it feels a little bloody, but also somehow like healthy and fresh.
I'm also aware that tomatoes used to be called love apples. And, they're vibrant. And I believe that symbolically they do stand for love.
Yeah, that's nice. Yeah.
Well, maybe that's a place to leave the dreamer for now.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.